Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ryan Peterson. I'm from the Central Bank of Aruba. Pleasure to be here to present to you a presentation on the One Happy Island Paradox, a political economic analysis of tourism and well-being in Aruba. This is based on a working paper at the Central Bank of Aruba on crafting inclusive tourism for cultivating community well-being, the case of the One Happy Island. I'll be briefly going through the outline of the presentation. No big surprises here, starting with some background and motivation, short summary on the theoretical background, the methodology I applied, slightly more qualitative than the previous two presentations, and then moving on into the results and some of the conclusions. So this research stems forth from a question that has been asked throughout the Caribbean now for quite some time, well over a decade, whether our economic development has stagnated. Not a new question. And this comes at the same time with other observations indicating that despite the significant growth in tourism, almost doubling over the past 25 years in the Caribbean, economic development has not progressed significantly across the Caribbean. So that was more of the general backdrop. Against that backdrop, there was also the observation, and this is where I get into the One Happy Island paradox, looking specifically at the context of Aruba. On the one hand, we see a growth in terms of tourism revenues. We see almost 60% of the GDP is based on tourism revenues and exports, 2.4 million visitors on the island, foreign-driven ownership of properties, accommodations, well over 20,000 rooms. The tourism workforce accounts for 16,000 people directly, approximately 30 to 35%. Relatively high revenue per available room and very strong tourism tax revenues collected by the government. Yet by the same token, and that's the other side of the coin, economic development, different agencies, different institutions over the past 5 years, and slightly before that also, have noticed some other types of developments. These include that a dropping real gross national income per capita, community sentiments that remain under 100 and 100 being more of a neutral point, affordable housing, 64% of the population indicates that they cannot afford a house. This is also confirmed by other studies indicating that the price to income ratio for housing is well over 3, close to 4.5. 55% of the population indicates that our infrastructure is in deterioration. There's social development concerns in terms of poverty, income inequality as measured by the Palmer ratio is well over 5, and last but not least, a tourism benefit retention ratio of less than 25%. So here we have these two different developments, or at least trends going on the island, which led me to dive deeper in research, really looking at how do we deconstruct small island tourism economies. And the general approach in terms of theoretical frameworks has been the tourism-led growth hypothesis, or the tourism growth hypothesis, which indicates that tourism growth leads to economic development. It's the main paradigm, theoretical paradigm, well established in literature for the past 40 years that has been applied. However, over the past the past decade for sure, there has been a critical turn in research, particularly in tourism research studies, moving beyond the tourism growth hypothesis, looking at what we call the more tourism social justice paradigm to see how this economic development, if and how this would translate into community well-being, and how social justice in terms of procedural justice and distributive justice, how they play an enabling role in making sure that the community, the citizens, that they actually participate in terms of those decision-making, the tourism planning and tourism governance, but also how the community benefits from tourism, not only in terms of the revenues that accrue to government and tax revenues, but how these revenues are then reinvested. So this was more of the background, the theoretical framing of the study that I conducted. In terms of the research design, as I mentioned, slightly more qualitative. It's a mixed method research design. There were three broad areas that I applied here. On the one hand, conducting a policy archive analysis more qualitatively, going back at least 60 to 70 years and applying critical discourse analysis there to see what the main themes and topics were from a policy perspective, to what extent these master plans were applied or implemented or not. And we relied on different strategies and sources. Next to that, we also collected data from different institutions on the island, the Aruba Tourism Authority, the Hotel and Tourism Association, Central Bureau of Statistics, the Central Bank of Aruba, Department of Labor, and we also try to collect as much as possible data from the Nature and Environment Department. And last but not least, the variables that we collected were we looked at tourism intensity, the tourism density, tourism credits, the real national income per capita, the income distribution, and the community sentiments. And we try to conduct some basic nonlinear regression analysis with a lag on the data that we collected. So in terms of the results, I'll first outline the qualitative results and then identify and discuss the quantitative results. And this is basically in one or two pictures actually where Aruba started in 1925 with tourism. This was the first guest house. And on the other picture, the colored picture, you see the last guest house. This is 100 years of basically tourism development. And in a really simplistic way, let me just take you on the story of tourism development, starting way back, as I said, in 1925. Back then, there was no tourism, there was agriculture, there was mining on the island. The oil refinery opened up later on. Cruise ships started to come to the island, and slowly but surely you see the beginnings of an island developing and getting involved in tourism. Then by the 1960s, first hotel resort opened up, luxury hotel resort opened up, airlines started to come to the island. And by the 1970s, we saw a strong shift in the Caribbean, but definitely also on Aruba in terms of diversifying the tourism product, not only towards stayover visitors, but also towards timeshare tourists that would buy a second home on the island. By the 1980s, with the closing of the oil refinery in the early 1990s, tourism was well and booming on the island, and tourism was expanding across different areas of the island. And if we then look back 50 years ago to today, this is how the island has actually evolved over time in terms of its tourism infrastructure and the services that it's provided. And it's one of the most tourism-intense islands in the Caribbean. And this is a view of what it looks like today. Most, if not all of our coastal areas, beaches, are built up with hotels in which visitors enjoy our beaches. But the story doesn't end there. The story continues. Tourism is very dynamic. It evolves over time. So over the past 5 years, particularly, let's say after COVID, there is a new development going on, which is not only concentrated in one location, but now has evolved into bungalow parks, if you like, moving into the ocean, evolving the product no longer within the tourism corridor zone, but even beyond the tourism corridor zone, which has led to what we call a tourism regrowth post-COVID, very strongly so, double-digit numbers. And as a result of this strong growth, but not only post-COVID, but previous to that, there have been some questions raised on the island whether Aruba should continue developing more hotels, whether the land belongs to the people or to the visitors as properties are being sold. Not only are properties being sold in terms of land, but also in terms of housing, particularly because of a strong, very short-term rental market that now accounts for almost 40% of the market on Aruba. So a huge intensity of tourism. So this is more of a qualitative, visual way of illustrating how tourism has evolved and some of the questions. And when we turn towards the more, let's say, quantitative impacts of the study, looking specifically at data as of 2000, indeed reflecting the growth in tourism, but also the significant drop in tourism in 2020 due to the COVID. So, but however, despite this growth, as I mentioned before, there's also the observation that there's stagnant economic development over the past years. In fact, the real gross national income for Aruba has been stagnant, if not slightly declining, and this is despite significant growth. The results also show that there is a diminishing tourism revenue retention rate. If back in 2000 the retention rate was up in the 30s%, right now the retention rate, which is actually opposite of the economic leakage rate, is 25, if not less. In addition to that, there is also where am I? There's also an indication that income inequality, as measured by the Palmer ratio, which looks at the 10% top earners versus the bottom 50%, that ratio has also been increasing. So while the island has been earning as a country more money, the traditional, let's say, trickle-down economic theory that whatever happens goes to the community, that obviously has not applied to Aruba, particularly over the past 20, 25 years. And this, of course, raises questions towards the future.
Can you define the tourism retention rate for us?
Yes, the tourism retention rate is, theoretically speaking, the opposite of the economic leakage rate, and is measured by the gross tourism credits, or taking the tourism value added divided by the gross tourism credit, as described in the paper.
So you're talking about the tourism value added in the GDP accounts
Yes,
and the tourism credits in the balance of payments.
yes. So that would be the tourism retention rate. And also in terms of income inequality, as I mentioned, there's a rising income inequality on the island over the past at least 10 to 15 years for sure. And when we then calculated the nonlinear dynamic regression analysis, we indeed confirmed that there was a significant threshold effect in terms of tourism intensity, in which tourism intensity in the early years of development did contribute to, let's say, real national income and even positive community sentiments. But after a certain point of development, threshold effect, the intensity, we then entered into more of a diminishing return of these positive effects of tourism. And this also applies towards the tourism retention rate, in which that there's a higher rate of leakage moving after a certain point. This was approximately by 2004, 2005, when we had approximately 14 to 15 visitors per resident on island. In terms of the conclusions, we see from a, let's say, tourism governance and tourism strategy perspective, tourism that in the early 60s and 70s was very strongly rooted in the community, was professionalized. There were national organizations that were formed, public organizations, agencies that led tourism. And by 2008, 2009, 2011, many of these agencies were privatized, and many of the benefits and revenues then accrued to the private corporations, thereby also likely increasing the leakage rate and minimizing the retention rate. In terms of the relationships and social networks, the community of Aruba early on in its development was actively involved. It was embedded in local entrepreneurship. And over the years, because of an export-led strategy, many of these initiatives are now foreign-owned by foreign investors, causing also that profits leak out of the economy. And last but not least, from a tourism social justice perspective, in terms of procedural justice, in terms of distributive justice, we see that less and less of the voice of the community is incorporated in tourism planning and policy development, and less of these benefits are accruing directly to them, hence raising the question whether the high-value, low-impact model is really a high value for who that high value is and for who that low impact is. Let me go skip straight through the conclusions. In terms of the theoretical contribution, this was obviously more contributing to theory than a theory testing study, looking at the small island economy from a critical perspective, moving beyond looking at tourism volume to tourism values, particularly from a political economic perspective, and possibly, and that's future research, providing an explanation for a dual economy in which 10 to 15% of the population enjoys the benefits of tourism, but the larger majority may not be enjoying those benefits and actually carrying the burden of these intense developments. In terms of policy recommendations, I believe there are several policy recommendations in terms of, first of all, how do we now internalize the costs of tourism? This would include, for instance, tax, compliance, and regulation, but also strengthening the local linkages with the businesses and local sourcing. In terms of innovation, tax reform and fixer reforms are important, but also spatial planning and what we call community first zoning. Many of the
Excuse me
properties.
again, Ryan. Are we supposed to be seeing the slides?
Yes, there you go. Thank you, sir. So many of these policies also involve not only tax reforms, but also spatial planning in terms of how the spatial planning has evolved over time in properties that are no longer available for the community. And last but not least, discussion that has been held quite some time on the island is the question of moratoria. Are enough hotels do we have right now? Are they enough? How do we establish these at the national level, at the regional level? But also the important question of how do we get the community back involved in decision making and planning so that the voice of the community is heard in the decisions that are made with regard to the future development of the island. Hence also the importance of civic engagement. And last but not least, future studies. Obviously, there are many different limitations. It is one single case study of an island, which means that it cannot be generalized to any other country in that matter. However, I do believe that by means of multi-case studies, other case studies in small island tourism economies, that some of these lessons learned could be validated again. A second area of further research is the econometric deepening of the relationships proposed in this study. But I also believe that looking at the lived experiences in the communities would be more of a qualitative ethnographic study that could add significant value. Fourthly, this study was more focused on the political ecology, our economy, but the part of the environment is equally important, hence calling for more political, ecological perspective. And last but not least, when looking at social justice, this study focused on procedural justice and distributive justice. However, there's also restorative justice and other forms of social justice that could be incorporated in the study and in future studies. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you for that fascinating paper, Ryan. And now to Duvenci Pascal. I think I botched your name again, but then, okay.
Thank you, Ryan, for your great presentation. First, starting off, I would like to start with some general comments. I think that this paper is especially relevant for policymakers in economies where tourism sector is developing itself. The paper also provides a great historical context for development in Aruba, which I think can be very valuable for, again, economies that are growing their tourism product. Um, Reading the paper and looking at the timeline you provided in the paper, it also seems from a perspective in Curacao that the development timeline that you outlined for Aruba is happening at a faster pace on other islands at the moment. I will be skipping over some of the summary because I think that you covered that very well. Some of the strengths in the paper is, of course, or I think the mixed methodology that you employed. It's a comprehensive study, or it's comprehensive method that was applied. It integrates quantitative data with quality analysis of archival plans, policies, which allows for a rich analysis of the current situation in Aruba and how it reached that point, which strengthens the findings. It also gives great backing up with the statistical analysis provided, which again gives a rich and valid understanding of what's going on. The argumentation is also critical, it's evidence-based, and you've presented a compelling narrative which links tourism expansion to social inequality. The argumentation is well supported with evidence, for instance, data on income distribution, tourism revenue leakage, and local living standards, illustrating how tourism growth benefited a few while marginalizing the many. The paper engages relevant literature and theory, and it reinforces broader calls to rethink tourism growth models, which you've highlighted quite explicitly in your presentation, and the overall points of logical structure and moving beyond diagnosing the paradox problem through analysis of clear conclusion makes a convincing case of future steps that Aruba should be taking. Coming back to the theoretical framing, the social justice lens, the study is grounded in strong theoretical framing. It bridges tourism studies with social justice theory, viewing inclusive tourism through social justice principles, concept of distribution, procedural justice that guide the analysis, aligning the work with critical tourism scholarship. This normative framing is strengthened and it elevates beyond the economic scope, and it highlights the ethical dimensions of tourism. And it also provides a great understanding of the context in which Aruba finds itself. I think you've mentioned a lot of the refinements that I have found myself, but nevertheless, I would like to emphasize on some of them. You've indicated already that this study, and it's stated in the paper also, that this is a single case study for Aruba. This limits the generalization beyond Aruba itself. But as I indicated at the beginning, nevertheless, I do think that for economies that are coming up, it provides great lessons learned. Secondly, I would like to think that employing or implementing, you indicated that it's a working paper, implementing primary data sources, so conducting surveys among the population on their sentiment of tourism growth will be of great benefit to the paper itself. At the moment, the sentiment studies that is being referenced do not directly correlate to tourism aspects directly. So I think implementation of such a perspective would add great weight to the paper. I also would like to comment that the paper could use a bit more balance, if I can say it like that. It highlights a lot of the adverse effects of tourism development in Aruba, at least in its later stage. So it could benefit from also highlighting the benefits of tourism, which has contributed to Aruba's prosperity, to provide a more balanced case for the paper. In addition, I would like to also indicate that even though the study is focused on Aruba once more, I do think that providing a benchmarking of how tourism development has occurred in the Caribbean and what it has done to the welfare of those communities, in contrast to Aruba, would also again provide a balance to clearly indicate if the developments are negative on the welfare of the population of Aruba, or if this has increased the, let's say, the living standard in a greater way than other economies have experienced. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much for your comments. I think your points are well taken, and I will definitely look into them. And let me just respond to some of the points that you made and connect the dots also. I do believe that indeed, as I mentioned, and as you pointed out, the study looks at Aruba, the historical context of Aruba, and how tourism evolved over time. And I do believe that there's some lessons learned there, but it would definitely take more of that same contextualized research in different countries, in different cases in the Caribbean. Some initial studies have been conducted on this, but I do believe, as you pointed out, that primary data would be very essential, not only for Aruba. There has been some initial baseline assessments, but also in the Caribbean to get that balanced view, of course. And with regard to the benchmarking for the Caribbean, but also going back to your balanced perspective, as I pointed out, there was a significant contribution to tourism in Aruba in terms of job creation, in terms of economic growth. So there is enough evidence suggesting that the wealth angle of tourism is there, but what the research also indicates that beyond a certain point, that wealth becomes so concentrated that the big question becomes then one of well-being for the general community, hence also the social justice angle to see how that wealth is then being distributed and if the community, the country, the citizens have a voice and if their rights and responsibilities are respected. But this is, as you well pointed out, this is research in progress. And I thank you once more for your comments, and we'll incorporate these also in a subsequent edition of the paper. Thank you.
So thanks very much, both Ryan and Duventy, for your paper and for the comments. As I said, a fascinating paper. I think we have time for one or two questions from the general audience. If anyone, please go ahead. I'm not seeing.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Naomi Francis from the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank. I have a question in relation to the mention of the increase in the income inequality. You could correct me if I was mistaken, but that was mentioned relative to the island earning more funds from tourism. So there's an increase in tourism receipts. So I wanted to know whether it is that the overdevelopment of tourism is what is causing that increase in inequality, and if that is the link being made, how did you come to that conclusion as opposed to looking at other bottlenecks that may result in the lack of spread of the funds? And the other question I have is, can we really reverse the effects of overdevelopment of tourism, especially in relation to community first? There's what I know of community-based tourism. Is that what you are suggesting that they put forward, and will that really reverse some of the effects that we are seeing with overdevelopment of tourism? Thank you.
Thank you for your question, or questions actually. Let me start with the first one, and I will interpret it in terms of transmission channels here, minutes, how the relationship between an increase in tourism receipts or credits, how that would translate into income inequality. And I believe there were, at least in this research, there were two mechanisms identified. One is the relatively lower registered tourism wage and wages and income in the workforce, if you like, while recognizing, of course, that there are also some earnings, secondary earnings that are not registered in tourism. So we're well aware of that. And the other one being that in terms of distribution and the redistribution mechanisms, many of the tax revenues, and not many, 75% of tax revenues as of 2011 that were paid by the hotels and the resorts to the government, that those tax revenues were privatized in terms of the Aruba Tourism Authority agency, which then would leverage and use that, reinvest that money for marketing campaigns. Hence also the generated tax revenues would not go, for instance, prior to that moment into other types of social services, infrastructure, education, healthcare programs. So there are at least two mechanisms that are at play here. One, you have a relatively low income, low wage earning population, of which at least 60 to 70% is non-local, which also alludes to remittances increasing. And secondly, you have a tax revenue mechanism in which taxes are highly concentrated and reused for other purposes rather than social community processes and projects. So that's the first question. The second question you had, and whether you could turn this around. Yes, I have to believe that you can turn this around, and I've seen other destinations try to turn this around. What is important here from a social justice perspective is that there are mechanisms created, legally anchored, institutionally anchored, to provide the community with that voice in their tourism development. And right now, that's not the case. Right now, many of the decisions being made are being made between private investors and certain ministries without considering the voice of the community. So I do believe considering the voice of the community is one. I also believe improving tax revenues and redirecting tax revenues to community-worthy social projects is important. And last but not least, also curbing the growth, not only in hotels, but regulating the tourism, the short-term tourism market, and make sure that everybody plays their own fair share so that we create a level playing field on island. So I do believe that we still have a way to go in terms of turning back some of these negative effects and making sure that the community can contribute or can benefit from the tourism growth that we see.
Okay, we're out of time. One final suggestion for all the research directors of our region is that we consider collaborating with Ryan on a regional project to compare his results with the situation in our own, well, particularly the tourism-based economies, Barbados, Bahamas, Jamaica, Antigua, etc. To see, because these are important issues that he has raised in this fascinating paper, and I think that a regional study which proceeds along these lines would be of major interest and major importance to us all, because after all, it's human development that we are all after. So with that, I invite you to join with me in congratulating all our authors on our presentations and a very large